They were.
Sorry guys, trying to get this microphone working.
It's all the top cabinet.
Okay, hopefully this is working, we'll see. Okay, here we go.
What did the lights do when you clap? Oh, that's old school.
All right, let me pray for us and we'll dive in. God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for this chance to get together. Thank you for a chance to talk through these issues and politics, Lord. Pray that you be honored in our time together. You help us to think clearly about these things, refine and shape our thinking. Help us to think according to your word. And pray that you be honored in our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, just a quick review of where we've been. First week was an introduction. Then we talked about the politics of religion. Then we talked about the duties of citizens. We talked about politics and relationships. Last week, Jeff talked about the politics of life. And this week, we're talking about the politics of family. And next week, we're going to talk about the politics of freedom and dignity. And that will be the final week, just in time for Election Day. Just a couple of reminders as we kick off here, this one on politics of family. We talked about why has God given the government authority. We talked about 3 reasons why. To protect life by maintaining justice, to secure the conditions of human fruitfulness and multiplying, and to set the stage for God's work of redemption. And we talked about this key verse that was we looked at. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. We also have talked about the church and the state and the family as 3 different spheres of authority that God has established. And today we're focusing on the family and how that sphere of authority intersects with the government. And we talked about different Christian postures towards the government. And I told you guys we have these one that we should enforce Christianity through the government, or that we should not enforce Christianity at all, it should be completely private. And what I said is no, we should seek to enforce aspects of Christianity through the government. And so we're going to be thinking about what those aspects are when it relates to the family today. So one of the questions I want to ask is, how do we form a society? How do we help people to have moral ethics and to act morally? And there's different views on how this actually works itself out. One view is this, that you have societal morals and ethics, and that then becomes reflected in society's laws, right? So somebody's heart is changed first, and then eventually that's reflected in the laws, okay? That's one way of thinking about it. And so this person might say, we teach good morals in the church, we teach good morals to our kids, we establish a moral society, and that filters into laws at some point. Another way to look at it is to say, no, we set up just moral laws, and that helps shape our ethics. It helps shape people's morals. So, any idea which is it?
Both.
Yes.
Trick question.
Trick question. It is both. The reality is that our laws shape our morals, and our morals then shape our laws. And so we are growing in both those areas, and everybody knows this who's had a child, because they establish certain boundaries, moral boundaries for their children, and those moral boundaries actually train your child to behave a certain way. At the same time, you want to shape your child's heart. You want to address them at a heart level and say, hey, what's going on with you? Why do you think you did this? And so both those things intersect to help train people to be moral. So there is an attitude today, that's secular liberalism, this idea of secular liberalism. And secular liberalism is the idea that, one, it's liberal, so all citizens, that means not liberal like politically liberal, but liberal as in freedom, that all citizens should be treated with equal regard with the protection of their liberties. Okay, so that's the liberalism, but it's also secular, which means the only constraints that should be placed on people's liberties are those that are not derived from religious beliefs. Does that make sense? That is, I think, a very growing view of how the government should function in our culture. But it is not the historic view of our founding fathers. Why do you think that is? Anybody see any problems with that? Yeah.
That even atheism, secularism, whatever you want to call it, inherently has its own religious belief system. So it's kind of a conflict of, it's a bit of a contradiction of terms.
Yeah. There is no such thing as a secular neutral position, okay? So everyone, everywhere brings their values and their beliefs into this political realm when they're making judgments and establishing politics. So there is no middle neutral ground.
It's always evolving.
It is. It would explain what you mean by that.
Well, as people change their minds about different things, then the rules change.
Right. That's true.
Right.
There's no transcendent basis if it's always just secular.
Not transcendent basis, but a lot of trends.
Yeah.
Don't people assume that with this whole idea of being progressive? Isn't that kind of the term that's more preferential?
Yeah.
You know, oh yeah, it's like climate change as opposed to, global warming. I mean, they're always trying to come up with something that is sort of ethereal, if you're cool, you're moving in this direction.
Yeah.
So,
Well, what secular liberalism ends up being is a way of saying, my values are valid to bring into this discussion, but your values are not, because your values have a religious basis. Does that make sense? And so because my values are not religious, I can bring them into this discussion, and that makes sense, but I can't bring your values even into this discussion, because otherwise that's violating this tenet of secular liberalism. So here's some of the ways this might come out and might be expressed, and we want to talk through these. One is this: you should not force your morality on others. You should not force your morality on others. What do you guys think? How would you respond to somebody who says that to you?
They are thereby enforcing that on us.
Oh, you should not force your morality. Oh, really? That
That's
seems
what they're
like a
doing.
moral statement.
Yeah.
Or
That's what they're
forcing
doing.
that on me.
Yes, exactly.
Literally every law enforces morality on
Right.
people.
Right.
Yes. Yes. And secularism and Christianity are deeply distinct ideologies of what it means to be human, what it means to be moral, what human flourishing looks like. And these ideologies are opposed to each other at a fundamental level. Brett, you just said something that goes to, I think, this next one. You can't legislate morality. How many of you guys have heard that? Can't legislate morality. What do you think about that?
We do.
You can.
Yeah.
Definitely
It also reduces freedom of speech,
What does?
the secular liberalism.
Yeah, it does.
Because if you say you cannot force, this means you cannot express.
can. Right.
You're not asking the person to agree with you, you're not even allowed to express.
Yes.
And what does the term force your morality mean?
Right.
What's the forcing? You
Yeah.
can't convert someone to be moral.
Yeah.
It has to be eventually their choice. You can't force someone to become a Christian or a Muslim. Eventually you have to believe it yourself.
Right. Yeah.
Isn't there some sense in which the more pragmatic your religious, moral views are, the more they're tolerated? Because, for instance, the Pope telling Joe Biden, oh yeah, no worries, man, take communion. It's all good. And you got Nancy Pelosi, and all these, basically all the whole Catholic contingent, which is very pragmatic. I mean, it's fine, and there's a little pushback, but it's so pragmatic that it's tolerable.
Yeah.
It's Protestantism that's not tolerable.
A lot of groups tolerate behavior that doesn't necessarily agree with their fundamental.
I'm talking
core
about
values.
religious, I'm talking
No,
about
but
religious
even
ideologies.
political
though.
groups will sometimes tolerate behavior of other politicians without saying something because they're being
Yeah,
pragmatic.
they're not Protestant.
Even though they may not agree with it.
They don't go for it, man.
Ted, did you have something?
Several things, but currently, in the context of our conversation here today, how are we defining morality?
We would probably define morality as that which is right and wrong, that which is, I'd probably keep it very simple, because otherwise we could get pretty deep into it.
Would you define it as reducing the amount of suffering in the world?
I think that might be a little bit too restrictive of a definition, so I think you've got to be careful about defining morality itself. I mean, that's a great question, is who's defining morality? What do we mean by morality, right? Even saying you can't legislate morality is a loaded term, so I think we'd want to say, you know, for the sake of this discussion, I'm just saying what's right and what's wrong. I don't want to get into the source of our morals and how do we determine what's moral, because otherwise we're going to go off track.
Right.
So, but, you know, there's a few responses to this though, literally every law legislates morality. There is not laws what would Congress have left to do if they could not legislate anything that touched on morality? Right? They have nothing. I mean, maybe name the state bird of something, but even that might have ecological concerns, and so there's moral implications to it. And so every law has moral implications. It's a moral issue how I drive my car on the highway, because I'm not a law unto myself, and my driving affects others. And so the law puts restraints and restrictions on me, and it does so rightly to help guard the lives of others, because life is a valuable thing, and that is a moral judgment.
And we have faith that the other people aren't gonna cross the line.
That's right. Depending on if you're in LA or so the only question is, whose morality should we legislate? That's the real question. Here's another way to put this. As long as I don't hurt anyone else, the government should leave me alone. Whatever consenting adults do is okay. How would we respond to that? If you're a libertarian today, this might be uncomfortable for you. Any thoughts?
Money's gotta be in there somewhere.
As long as I don't hurt anyone else, the government should leave me alone. The problem is define hurt. Exactly. What does it mean to hurt someone else? Because no man is an island unto himself, right? And the things that we do, the things we engage in, have implications on others. Let's say, you use this statement to say, I'm going to say, you know what? Consenting adults should be able to do what they want, therefore we should legalize prostitution, because they're just consenting adults, they can do what they want. If they started having rape and prostitution in your city, would that have an effect on you? If a legal prostitution brothel opened up next door to your house, probably would have some effect on you, right? It would have some harm on you. So the idea that we can just do whatever we want as long as it's just between me and you is not accurate. It has larger societal implications that would affect us. And so that's a
Because for the most part, it's hardly ever just between me and you.
yeah, we're not an island unto ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, here's the last one. Laws can't change hearts. Laws can't change hearts.
Oh, they can change society.
Yeah, but they can restrict the evil in the heart.
They can restrain actions, right? They can restrain actions. And when you restrain actions, the longer term effect of that often is a change of heart. And one example of this is prohibition. I was reading about prohibition this week, and it's actually crazy the amount of alcohol the average person drank before prohibition. It's something like 7.2 gallons per year.
Wow.
The average, that's per person, they drink 7.2 gallons per year. And it was also stronger alcohol than we have today because of the way they distilled it. And so, anyway, it's, and And the point this was making is people point to prohibition and say it wasn't, that it's an example of failure. The point this article is making is actually no, it succeeded because it sobered our nation up for about 10 years. And then things shifted, and when people started, when the laws were repealed, people were drinking at far lower levels than they had previously. In fact, it didn't return to drinking at the same level after Prohibition until 1975. Isn't that crazy?
Wow, yeah.
So it had a tremendous effect on the morals of our society and our culture. Even though people were bypassing it all the time, and there was runners taking stuff through. So anyway, laws can have a positive effect on society. So
Well,
But you wouldn't have NASCAR without it.
what's that?
You wouldn't have NASCAR.
there was less abortions when abortion was against the law.
Yeah, and that's a great one to talk about abortion, because people have said, I heard this today, that we just overturned Roe v. Wade, and now if you look at abortion statistics, abortions have skyrocketed, is what people will say. And I think there are statistics that may show that, but there's factors that go into that skyrocketing. Some of those factors are that now the abortion pill has become a huge push to make that very widely available and easily available. And so that's a huge factor in that. And in the states where they have enacted laws that have curbed or limited abortions have plummeted. And in states that neighbor those states, some of the abortion rates have gone up, but not to offset how much they've plummeted. So
Do they even track abortion pill usage as abortions, or is that only you go to a clinic to have abortion? In other words,
that's
abortion
a really great job.
down, but if the number one choice is to do a chemical abortion at home, is that even being tracked?
Well, they don't track abortions, that's
So
part of
then
the problem.
abortion could be a recognized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every other diagnosis, disease, surgical treatment, everything
Right.
is tracked with incredible, specificity, abortion not.
And they even call abortion healthcare.
Yeah,
So you should think they would track it.
abortion clinics don't have to get inspected for,
As an OB nurse, I think giving mesoprostol at home is very dangerous.
yeah,
You can bleed out, I mean, it's I've done it in the hospital with babies that were, had fetal demise and you want to deliver, and we gave them that, but we had to monitor them very carefully because it's dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, you buy it over the counter, you don't need a prescription, it's not monitored at all.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
That's what-
So the studies I read must have
Yeah.
been some specific studies that are trying to monitor certain things, but
Yeah.
there probably isn't any data that's good at a national level. So talking about the family, moving on from abortion. So I think that the biggest issue related to the family, the most devastating and damaging political decision of my time, is the issue of same-sex marriage and Obergefell, which is the Supreme Court decision that declared same-sex marriage constitutional. In Obergefell, during the arguments before the Supreme Court, the central issue that was being discussed is by Justice Kennedy, who ended up writing the majority opinion. He a number of times brought up the dignity that marriage bestows upon individuals. And that was his central argument, that all people deserve dignity no matter their sexual orientation, and that dignity is protected by the 14th Amendment. Therefore, we have to extend marriage to same-sex individuals. So here's how he put it in the actual court decision. I really enjoy reading Supreme Court transcripts and decisions. They're really interesting. You guys will see why. So the nature of marriage is that through its enduring bond, two persons can together find other freedoms such as intimacy, and spirituality. This is true for all persons, whatever their sexual orientation. Okay, guess what? He just defined marriage as being open, not male, female. because he said the nature of marriage is its enduring bond between two persons. He says there is a dignity in that bond between two men and two women who seek to marry and in their autonomy to make such profound choices. Excluding same-sex couples from marriage thus conflicts with the central premise of the right to marry. He continues, as the state makes marriage all the more precious by the significance it attaches to it, exclusion from that status has the effect of teaching that gays and lesbians are unequal in important respects. It demeans gays and lesbians for the state to lock them out of the central institution of our nation's society. Same-sex couples, too, may aspire to transcendent purposes of marriage and seek fulfillment in its highest meaning. The limitation of marriage to opposite-sex couples may long have seemed natural and just, but its inconsistency with the central meaning of the fundamental right to marry is now manifest. With that knowledge, we must come the recognition that laws excluding same-sex couples from marriage, laws excluding same-sex couples from the marriage right impose stigma and injury of the kind prohibited by our basic charter. Okay, so this fundamental change in our society was enacted by 5 Supreme Court justices. And it's crazy to think that in California, which is not the most conservative state around, just 7 years earlier in 2008, the voters passed Proposition 8, which banned same-sex marriage by a majority vote. That's crazy to think about, isn't it? And then this is passed, and although this was passed by the Supreme Court, it was vigorously repudiated by the other 4 justices on the court, so much that each of them wrote a separate dissent, which is not normal for Supreme Court decisions. And we know that Justice Thomas, Justice Roberts, and Alito are still on the court. Scalia is no longer on the court, but because he's with Jesus, and we pray. But here's what Alito said. Here's what Alito's dissent said. He says, the Constitution says nothing about the right to same-sex marriage, but the court holds that the term liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment encompasses this right. Our nation was founded upon the principles that every person has the unalienable right to liberty. But liberty is a term of many meanings. For classical liberals, it may include economic rights now limited by government regulation. For social democrats, it may include the right to a variety of government benefits. For today's majority, it has a distinctively postmodern meaning. To prevent 5 elected justices from imposing their personal vision of liberty upon the American people, the court has held that liberty under the Due Process Clause should be understood to protect only those rights that are deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And it is beyond dispute that the right to same-sex marriage is not among those rights. So Alito very strongly did it, but I was very strongly dissented. But my favorite Supreme Court justice is Justice Scalia, and his response. I have an entire book on Scalia's dissents. It's really amazing. Just read his dissents. Anyway, he says this. It's a great book. He says this. But what really astounds is the hubris reflected in today's judicial putsch. Putsch is a violent overthrow of the government. The 5 justices who compose today's majority are entirely comfortable with concluding that every state violated the Constitution for all 135 years between the 14th Amendment's ratification and the Massachusetts permitting same-sex marriages in 2003. They've discovered in the 14th Amendment a fundamental right overlooked by every person alive at the time of ratification, and almost everyone else in the time since. They see what lesser legal minds could not. These justices know that limiting marriage to one man and one woman is contrary to reason. They know that an institution as old as the government itself and accepted by every nation in history until 15 years ago cannot possibly be supported by anything other than ignorance or bigotry. And they are willing to say that any citizen who does not agree with that, who adheres to what was, until 15 years ago, the unanimous judgment of all generations and all societies, stands against the Constitution. The opinion is couched in a style that is as pretentious as its content is egotistic. Hubris is sometimes defined as overweening pride, and pride, we know, goeth before a fall. Anyway, he didn't have some strong words. So the sorry, I didn't put the next slide up there. So the argument of the majority is marriage bestows dignity upon humans and ennobles them. All people deserve dignity, no matter their sexual orientation, and therefore we must allow same-sex couples to marry. Now, the opposing lawyer who was arguing in the court, he said that the central facet of marriage is that not that it bestows dignity, but rather that its main purpose is centered around procreation. And so that was his argument. And I agree that procreation is a central purpose of marriage. But I think that my opinion is in the oral arguments, it was a wrong move to not address dignity head on. Because I think every single person knows that marriage is a dignified institution. And we see that in marriage. But what makes it dignified is not that we call someone married and boom, it's dignified, right? What makes it dignified is that marriage is the union of two profoundly different people who are complementary individuals, man and woman, who are more complete together than they were apart. And marriage is dignified because it pictures God's relationship with his people. And so we know this is what makes marriage the dignified and ennobled institution that it is. And so you can't just slap marriage on something, the name marriage on something that's not marriage, and say, now those people are dignified and ennobled. No, that's not how it works. It's the very essence of the institution that dignifies them, not the label marriage that you're going to now falsely apply to something that is actually not marriage. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm not a libertarian, but let's say you were talking to a libertarian that's not a believer, and he would say, why isn't the government in the business of issuing marriage licenses? I mean, I don't know, in biblical times, did the government issue licenses? Or did Jew marry Jew and Gentile, whatever it is why is the government in the business of marriage?
Yeah,
Issuing
why
licenses,
is the government in the business of marriage at all, right?
And so that way, if let's use one of your religious classes, let's say I'm a Hindu and I want to marry someone of the same sex. If that religious church is willing to marry those two people under their definition of marriage, why would it matter in a non-theocracy government like ours? Why would it matter? I understand theologically, God's picture and all that stuff, but why in a democracy would it matter?
Right. Yeah, and I've heard that argument from Christians is the government just needs to get out of the business of marriage and just leave it to individual religious groups. The problem with that is that the government has an important role to play in marriage. So think about how many laws are related to marriage that the government has to regulate. There's divorce law is an entire area of dispute, right? And so the government is involved in helping people equitably divide their resources when people get divorced. The government is involved in making sure that a spouse isn't forced to testify against their spouse, right? So the government guarantees that you'll have certain benefits if your spouse dies, that you'll have the right to visit your spouse when they're sick and in prison.
But a libertarian would dismiss all that because they're very limited government type people. They would say the government should be involved in that either. They should, in other words, stay out of the marriage business with tax deductions, with encouraging childbearing. And I just, this is just what I've heard from that platform. How do you, in a non-religious culture, without giving a biblical reason, can make a cogent answer to that person?
There wouldn't be any protection for people in certain situations.
Yeah, I would say the government has a right role to play. I mean, it goes back to what is the role of government? Is the role of government just to stand back and do as little as possible? How can the government do that and protect human flourishing if it doesn't recognize marriage.
Didn't Scalia or the guy before say that same-sex marriage is not in the Constitution? Is marriage, the right to marry in Constitution?
They would say, yeah, I think they
How
would
much
say.
is it actually? I don't know, because I'm not.
Yeah, they would, because they would say that the right to marry is in the Constitution, and they point, because some of the cases that were relevant is cases that restricted interracial marriage. And so they said, no, every human has a right to marry, and that's embedded in the due process clause of the Constitution.
It's not same-sex marriage.
But not
It didn't say
same-sex.
Constitution, it said charter. That's political. I mean, so it's not a biblical government. It's a chartered government. It's a constitution.
Well, and they think they
It's a
mean
political
Constitution by
government.
charter.
It's a
That's how I
political
interpret
government
that.
though, so why not? I mean, if somebody's gonna make money, because everybody's a lawyer in government, so they're gonna make money and they're not gonna diss their buddies, who are making money from divorce and
Yeah.
all kinds of, the fertility issues and all the other stuff that happens, man. I mean,
Yeah.
geez.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay.
I mean, the premise, are we, because we can't go off the premise that it's a Christian government.
No, but we should go off the premise, and so one of the things we have to decide, like I said, whose morality do we legislate? And the truth is, as Christians, we should advocate for true morality to be legislated, biblical morality. And that's a question we're gonna continue to get into here, and so what does that look like? Kevin DeYoung put it this way. He says, the promotion and legal recognition of homosexual unions is not in the interest of the common good. That may sound benighted, if not bigoted, but we must say it in love. Codifying the indistinguishability of gender will not make for the peace of the city. It rubs against the grain of the universe, and when you rub against the grain of divine design, you're bound to get splinters. Or worse, the society which says sex is up to your own definition and the family unit is utterly fungible is not a society that serves its children, its women, or its long-term well-being. Okay.
But this is a government that outlawed prayer rule. I mean, that's really where it all started. They just said, no, God's out.
Yeah,
So
I
now
agree.
anything can happen.
Yeah,
So, I mean, why is this a big mystery? I mean,
yeah. It's not a mystery, but it's also something I think we need to be aware of.
We're in it, we're in it.
Yeah. So, here, let's watch a quick video. Oh, I'm gonna pause it because the volume's too low. Let me turn the volume up.
A controversial policy issue. As Christians, we believe it's our responsibility to stay informed about our faith and understand how our views translate into not only our personal lives, but also our culture and government. One of the most debated topics in our country is same-sex marriage, and we think there's a respectful, loving, and logical way to address the subject. So that's what we're going to do. Before delving in, there are a few things we need to consider. First is the language we use. We are addressing same-sex marriage, not gay marriage. The government isn't concerned with sexual preference, it cares about gender. Where marriage is defined as a man and a woman, there is no ban on same-sex marriage. There's simply no legal provision for it. Secondly, we are raising principled objections to same-sex marriage. This is in no way related to bigotry, narrow-mindedness, or arrogance. It doesn't have to do with intolerance, whether or not we think adopting same-sex marriage into our culture is a positive policy decision. Now that we've discussed our approach, we can talk about the heart of the issue, marriage. Marriage is not defined, it's described. It's a fixed feature of the natural order, not invented by people. Marriage relationships produce the next generation. In fact, families that consist of a father and a mother are the building blocks of our society. So what does that mean for same-sex couples? Well, it means that changing language or laws doesn't change the nature of marriage. Same-sex marriage is a modern contradiction. There are many arguments for and against same-sex marriages. It's our goal to give others reasons before rules. So, we thought we'd take a closer look at a few major arguments. Different kinds of relationships serve different purposes, and the government has no obligation to give every kind of relationship the same entitlements. Heterosexual marriages have a unique role in society, which is to sustain civilization through procreation. This is why the government automatically grants related benefits like inheritance rights to a married man and a woman. It's not unfair to treat different kinds of relationships differently. The circumstances are not the same. Skin color is morally trivial, while there is an enormous difference between a man and a woman. Race has no bearing on marriage, but sex is fundamental. Plus, same-sex marriage is not an attempt to include those wrongly disenfranchised from an existing institution, but to abolish that institution and substitute a radically different one under the same one. Spousal rights and marital traditions have changed. However, marriage has always been between males and females because of the unique function they perform in society. Marriage can't be a social construction because cultures emerge when humans reproduce. This means that cultures cannot be the constructors of the marriages that make culture possible in the first place. Bricks make the building, not the building the bricks. Culture does not construct marriage. Marriage and family construct culture. Some marriages are barren by choice or by circumstance. Even so, the natural marriage and procreation connection is not nullified because in some cases children are not intended or even possible. The state protects conjugal marriage because of its institutional importance to culture. This sentiment reflects a common misconception. That is that same-sex marriage will secure new liberties for homosexuals. Same-sex couples can express love, have weddings, share home ownership, have sex, commingle property, receive inheritance, and spend their lives together. Same-sex marriage grants no new freedom and restricts no liberty. What does all this mean? By equating same-sex unions with heterosexual unions, it changes culture at its core. And with that change, two things rapidly follow. First, anyone continuing to make the gender distinctions dictated by nature will come into conflict with a law dictated by men. Second, the boundaries of marriage will continue to expand as the state continues to tinker. As our culture equates same-sex and heterosexual marriage more and more, we are ignoring the very roots of the world we have today. Adoption legislation, rights of association, religious practices, freedom of speech, and issues of conscience will all suffer harm. Marriage, family, and parenthood will continue to be redefined. To sum things up, same-sex marriage is not about civil rights. It actually boils down to validation and social approval. It's an attempt to push people to accommodate a lifestyle they might find morally wrong. Today, homosexuality is broadly tolerated in this country, though it isn't universally accepted. Homosexuals have the liberty to live as they choose without fear of backlash. Redefining marriage is contrary to nature, socially destructive, and will be used to infringe on the religious conscience of those who disagree. We're not intolerant, and it's not bigotry. We have rational reasons based on nature that cross history, cultures, and religions. Favoring a live and let live attitude toward a lifestyle doesn't justify redefining an institution that has served humanity well since the beginning of time.
Is that Coco's deal?
Yeah, Greg
that's what I
Cope's
thought.
ministry. That was not Greg speaking, but that was his ministry. Okay. So, and the question that comes up, isn't that going to restrict rights from homosexuals? Grudem puts it this way. The answer is that when a law defines marriage between one man and one woman, it does not prohibit any homosexual person from marrying. They would just have to marry someone the same way everyone else in society has to marry. Namely, they have to marry someone of the opposite sex. This right is extended equally to all unmarried adults in the society. Yet when homosexuals claim they want to marry another person of the same sex, they're not simply claiming the right to marry that is available to everyone else in society. Rather, they are claiming a new right that has not previously been available to anyone in this society, namely, the right to marry someone of the same sex. Such a right has been denied to everyone in the society prior to this time, so it is not discriminating against them to say that this kind of right is denied to them. The proponent of same-sex marriage is really claiming the right to redefine marriage according to their own desires and preferences. He's not just claiming a private right for himself, but is claiming a right to change the definition of marriage that has been adopted by the whole of society. And the law is correct when it denies him the right to do this. All right. So that leads to a question that should same-sex couples be afforded the same rights as heterosexual married couples have by the government? Should they have the same rights? And there's three options on how you answer this. No, They should have none of the rights of heterosexual couples. There should be no sort of recognition of any sort of bond. 2, they should have all the rights of heterosexual couples, but we should not redefine marriage. That would be kind of like people who would advocate for what's called domestic partnership. And then 3rd, they should have some of the rights of heterosexual couples, but the government should still uniquely promote true heterosexual marriage because this allows society to flourish. And I would argue that last one, that they should have some rights. But the rights that they should have are not the same rights. We don't have to give equal status to a homosexual bond as we do to a heterosexual marriage. So, for example, they should have the right to meet one another, to purchase homes together, to have property bequeathed to one another, to have visitation rights in hospitals and prisons, etc. But some rights, I think, should be reserved for actual true marriages between heterosexuals. And an example of that would be adoption. In my opinion, adoption should be reserved for heterosexuals. Because adoption affects children. And this is not popular in our culture to say, but the psychological studies are consistent in saying that the most healthy place for children to be raised is in a marriage between a man and a woman. And that is not even questionable in the studies. I mean, it's so clear that children who are raised without a mother and a father deal with more depression, all sorts of issues. So I saw a clip of Rosie O'Donnell talking about how her son came to her, and she's a lesbian, and he said, her son's name is Parker, and he said, I want to have a daddy. And she said, well, if you were to have a daddy, you wouldn't have me as a mommy, because I'm the kind of mommy that wants to marry another mommy. And you notice what just happened in that is the attention is shifted away from what the child needs to what she needs, what she wants, what she desires. And so she's saying, my personal desire trumps what you need. And that is what happens in homosexual relationships when they adopt. So, I'm trying to figure out where to go here because we only have 5 minutes. So, now what's interesting, I'm not going to watch this video, but what's interesting is that today, the subject has changed. You don't talk about same-sex marriage anymore. Now where's the discussion at? Transgenderism, right? That's where the discussion, that's where the heat is in the debate. And I think this change of subject is strategic and intentional because it's moving us on from talking about same-sex marriage and just leaving that as a given, codified in our law, I don't know about you, but it feels like it's been the law for a very long time. When I went back and was like, that decision was in 2015, that's when it changed. I was like, that's crazy that it's only been 9 years since then.
It's on our ballot again now.
Is it?
Yeah, well, there's one where they want to make it a constitutional right in California.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah. So, I wonder what will happen now. We'll see. And so, let's talk about transgender ideology. Most of you, this is probably aware of this, but what the transgender ideology says is that sex is not the same thing as gender. Yeah. That sex is biology, it's assigned at birth, and gender is our identity. It's a social construct. It's changeable. It's dependent on how you feel about yourself, and it's not a binary. It's not male or female, it's a spectrum. So I'm like, today I'm feeling like maybe 90% male, maybe like 10% there's some sensitivity going on female. That's the spectrum that's going on. But then you try to define those things, and they're not definable. There are these ethereal ideas out there that's just, you cannot define what is maleness and what is femaleness, what is masculinity, what is femininity. There is no definition of that available. And if they try to define it, they'll define it in a circle. So, yeah, do you have a question?
Having been in a high school in the last 5 years, Most of what they would say is sex is female and male. Your gender identity is where you get into man and woman. Gender identity can't be male or female.
Yeah.
Your sex is male and female. It's what's on your driver's license, but gender identity is where you get the whole she, her, they, them,
Right.
he.
Yeah. It's fluid, it's malleable, it's changeable, it's what you, how you feel about yourself at the moment. And it can change from time to time. So, you know what I would say in response to this, what does the Bible say about transgenderism? Well, the Bible views gender and biological sex as an inseparable unity. They are inseparably related. And you might have, the thing that is always brought up that we're going to let Jeff talk about in just a moment here is what about these intersex, or people who have, he's going to talk about the right term to use for that. That's not the right term, that's the old term. What do you deal with that? Well, the Bible does touch on this. In Matthew 19, verse 10, it says this, the disciples said to him, if such is the case with a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. And then he explains it, for there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive this, receive it. So he talks about three classes of eunuchs. Those who are born eunuchs. That would be people who are born with some sort of a sexual disorder that would prevent them from having normal sexual relations and therefore a normal relationship and marriage. Okay? There's second category, but those who've been made eunuchs by men, which sounds pretty horrible and is pretty horrible. It happened a lot back then because you had harems, and they would want a man to run the harem who could not participate in the harem. And so they would make people eunuchs, they would make men eunuchs in order so that they could run the harem. And then the third category is not somebody who makes himself a literal physical eunuch, but somebody who chooses to forgo marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven and pursue singleness for the rest of his life. So the Bible deals with this. Jesus talks about it. And this is something that Scripture sees. It also tells us that a woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall put on a man's cloak. Man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. God tells us, I make you man and woman, and I expect you to align with what I say about that. Now, what God says about that does not always align with what our culture says, right? A girl doesn't have to enjoy going to tea parties or whatever girls do. And guys don't have to work on. A girl can work on trucks and think that's awesome, and that's fine. Some of those things we have to be careful about mixing up cultural expectations of masculinity and femininity and true biblical expectations of masculinity and femininity. All right.
That's pretty scary.
I'm gonna let Jeff share a little bit about this. He's got some. This is my favorite part of the message.
Do you want to stand? Oh, you want to change? All right. There you go. There we go. So just a couple quick things. I think in our cultural discourse, we talk about transgenderism. A lot of things get thrown at us. And so one thing I want to say is a lot of times you'll hear, studies are coming out showing that affirming people as the opposite sex, those with gender dysphoria, is a good thing. And it's interesting because those data are very, very tortured. Now our authority is the Bible. We don't look at scientific data, but if you really analyze scientific data correctly, you'll find that it reinforces what we know about the Bible. And this was a study done in 2011, huge study in Sweden of people that fully transitioned medically and surgically from one gender to the other. And this is the death rates after 30 years. And you see there's this fall off. That's normal. At the top of the screen is normal males and females that didn't, the general population. That's kind of the general population death for males and females. And then the bottom curves are ones that switch to the opposite sex, and their death rate is dramatically worse. So it's not good for you to try to medically and surgically transition. That's what I'd say. This is another one that was distorted. This was Journal of Psychiatry in 2019, gets referred to all the time. And basically what they did is they looked at their case of all the people in Sweden with gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, and followed them up over years and realized they used fewer mental services if they transitioned. Therefore, proof that it made them better because their mental health services went down over time. Anybody see a problem with that?
Correlation versus causation.
Huh?
Correlation versus causation.
And so that you're not knowing why they're having fewer mental health visits. Maybe they were, who knows why. So there is an organization called the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, SEGM, which is great. And they looked at the study and said, well, all science needs a control. This is a link to an article. And so they said, well, what about people that had gender dysphoria that didn't transition? What were their mental health services like? Well, guess what? They were the same. So basically, they showed that really transitioning people didn't truly cause a difference in mental health visits. So that's the background I want. So sometimes these data come out, and really when you dig deeper, now the problem is the original study gets referenced all over the place, and any corrections to it are kind of those little like retractions. The newspaper has a headline on the front page, and then later on page 10 they say, well, we've kind of misinformed you. It doesn't get publicized. But what Nathaniel was talking about is, what about exceptions to the rule? What about people that have different genetic anomalies or born with physical anomalies they're not perfectly male and female in the normal sense? What about the exceptions to the rule? And this came up, I'll go over this in a second. This came up when, I'm going to read our what we teach statement. When I became an elder, it said we need to look at our what we teach statement. And we said, what was in there is, we teach that biblical marriage consists only of a faithful heterosexual union between one genetic male and one genetic female. And biblical marriage is the only legitimate acceptable context for a sexual relationship. And then I said, well, there are conditions where people can be genetic males and yet appear to be females. And there are genetic females that can appear to be males because of some genetic and chromosomal anomalies. And that's this whole area that he's talking about. This is a great article. This is Alan Schliemann from Stand to Reason wrote an article, and a lot of it was from the recent Algerian boxer that was in the Olympics, that really created a lot of stir, because that person probably has some type of genetic disorder. They're not transgender, like normal male that want to be a female. They were actually probably having, and I'll go into that in a minute. But he covers this with incredible detail. I was impressed with his medical sophistication and how he described these in this article, and also his knowledge of that is actually very well done. So, like Nathaniel called the term intersex, that's what we used to call it. I'm so old that when I was in medical school and part of my internship, it was ambiguous genitalia was this whole category. Then it changed to intersex. Well, now it's DSD, disorders of sexual differentiation. A little less, little tamer maybe, and that's okay. And here's a list of all the disorders. If you look at the different genetic disorders of all these different things, maybe people have heard of hermaphrodite and pseudo-hermaphrodite and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to go through detail in all these. No, I'm just kidding. But it is complicated. That's one thing you can take away from this picture. So the one condition I wanted to mention, and maybe what this Algerian boxer had, no one's really confirmed it, is something called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Used to be called testicular feminization. And essentially what it is people are born, they have testicles, as a fetus they're forming, they have normal testicles, they are XY, okay, so they have the male chromosomes, but they have one deficiency in an enzyme, and their androgen, their testosterone, normally plugs into what's called an androgen receptor in the cell. So normally you have testosterone, and it has to have a receptor, a receiver in the cell to do its business, right? Well, what they are born with is a problem with that androgen receptor. So they have super high levels of testosterone, but the body doesn't see it, because the androgen receptor, there's nothing to plug into, if you will. And so what happens is they're born and they look like girls. From the outside parts, that's a girl. And they raise them and they're very feminized. Everything about them right up until puberty is very, very girlish. And then they find out that they actually don't have a uterus, tubes, ovaries, and they actually have 2 testicles inside their abdomen. And it's super high levels of testosterone, but the body's not seeing the testosterone, and they're not reacting to it. And the one other thing about embryology you should know is that if there's no, the default in development in the fetus is female. There's no hormone, that's the direction that things happen, and there has to be testosterone and another hormone called Mullerian inhibiting substance. But anyway, to create males. And so that's why these people, they look like girls, they act like girls, everything like that. And then when they get to puberty, they don't start their menstrual cycles, and then they start looking and they'll find out they don't have this. And then what the right thing to do, because they're girls, is not say, well, guess what? You're a male, you're XY, we got to now switch you over to boy. That would be the cruelest thing in the world because they're girls.
Yeah.
So that's their genetic sex is male, but in this case, they are very, very female. And so what is typically done medically is the testicles are removed from the abdomen because they can turn into cancer, and they're given estrogens to develop some other characteristics. And so that's an exception to the rule.
Does science have the ability to test them when they're little babies to see if they lack the antigen and provide it for them?
Yeah, a lot of times this is picked up during fetal ultrasounds because actually they'll not see a uterus, and then they'll look at the outside, and the outside they don't see male structures, and so sometimes nowadays in modern technology they'll pick this up a lot of times before birth.
So can they give the answer to this, whatever this?
No.
Would this person be able to somehow reproduce?
No.
Okay.
No. Only in the, no, because even their testicles don't have they don't have developed sperm.
Okay.
They have some very, very immature spermatogonial cells, and then not enough to do anything. Not without cloning, not without some extreme kind of situation.
Back on sci-fi.
Yeah, but anyway, the reason I mention this is because this is where I think, and Nathaniel already referenced the scripture about the eunuch's idea that there's some people that are born and it isn't clear. And this is where we should have grace. Now, the Algerian boxer, a lot of people think he might have the partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Not enough to create a male look as a baby. So that person very well may, the parts might look girl parts, right? But there may be enough testosterone because clearly the facial features, the muscle of this person look a little masculine. So some people think that she maybe have partial androgen sensitivity syndrome. So that's this area where sometimes if we get rigid about genetic sex and chromosomal sex and birth sex, we can sometimes be ungracious about people that have some of these issues.
What percentage of the population?
Well, about 1 out of 5,500 births have it. So very small, 0.018% or something, pretty low. And the reason I bring this up because when I became an elder, we were also looking at these statements. And the Nashville and Danvers statements are two statements about sexuality, human sexuality. And I think they handle this beautifully. This is Article 6, and it talks about, let me just read it. We affirm that those born with a physical disorder of sex development are created in the image of God and have dignity and worth equal to all other image bearers. They are acknowledged by our Lord Jesus and his words about eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, like Nathaniel just read. With all others, they are welcome as faithful followers of Jesus Christ and should embrace their biological sex insofar as it may be known. Because there are some that hermaphrodite, there's all these different conditions where it's really difficult. And instead of us saying, you got to be this gender or sex, it's a lot more difficult probably to figure out. But then it goes on, we deny that ambiguities related to a person's biological sex render one incapable of living a fruitful life in joyful obedience to Christ. And I thought that was an incredibly gracious statement. So we appended the whole Nashville and Danvers statement to our what we teach statement in our church because I think this addresses this whole area very, very well. So that's all I have.
Awesome.
And thanks.
Oh, yeah. So, thanks, Jeff. One thing you'll hear from people is when talking about disorders of DSD disorders, is that I've heard it cut out that this is 1 in 2,000 babies that are born this way. But what Jeff can correct me, but from my studies, what I've read is that anything with genitalia-related birth defects isn't classified in that category. And so what that means is you can have somebody who fully appears male, and is fully male, but maybe he has one testicle instead of two or something. And so then they're included in that number, when in reality that is not an ambiguous gender. That is very clear that this is a male, and will function as a male fully. So, or you can have, and so the true percentage, what I read is that it's 0.00018%.
Yeah.
And that might,
Yeah, that's where that 1 out of 5,500 comes
Okay.
from. There are some of these conditions that can show up with just a mild anomaly, like an undescended test, and then you dig further and find out there's something more going on. But you're right, how it's categorized at first can be a little confusing.
Yeah. All right. It's 10 after, so I was going to just point out 2 books that are really great. The Recovery of Family Life by Scott Yanor. He is a Christian, and he is a political science professor, and really great book on recovering family life. And then Legislating Morality by Frank Turek and Norman Geisler, both excellent books that touch on the issues we've talked about today. And just a reminder that our heart is to seek the welfare of the city. And so we want to promote policies that encourage that and promote the welfare of the city, including the family. So let me pray for us in prayer. Father, thank you for loving us. Thank you for creating the family and the way that you've orchestrated society to exist, Lord. I pray that you'd help us to be people who strongly represent you and honor you in our families. Pray, Lord, that you'd help us to exalt your name and show people your care for us, and help us to be wise in how we approach these issues with those around us. In Jesus' name, amen.